When Asa Hutchinson became governor of Arkansas in 2015, he faced one of the fastest growing prison populations in the country and a corresponding rise in the number of children going into foster care. He convened a summit titled Restore Hope and invited both government officials and leaders of the nonprofit and faith communities.
Arkansas has an opportunity to lead. We have an opportunity to lead in a way that is a partnership that you have already started, that we can expand on, that really can be an example and be a national leader. I've learned that there are many options to impact children's future, and as well as those that are coming back looking for a second chance. The people in this room reflect the people of Arkansas, and that we care. We care, we hope, we desire, we want to serve. It's just a matter of mobilizing that compassion that exists in the hearts of Arkansans.
Motivated by the governor's comments, an organization that shared the summit's name, Restore Hope Arkansas, took up the challenge to unify the efforts of the government and community through a collective impact model.
Most importantly, we need to look at the future. I want to assure you that I have no desire to convene this Restore Hope Summit and to leave here only with hope. We need to follow that with action, commitment, measuring sticks, determine how we've done, how we're growing, how many more are joining the effort, what progress we're making.
From that challenge, this conversation has emerged, exploring how to effectively address issues of justice for the families of Arkansas. This is Season 1, Episode 1 of the SmartJustice Podcast.
Crime and punishment are hot topics. Are there solutions different than what we're hearing about at a national level?
We led the nation in all the wrong categories, especially when it came to child welfare and recidivism. Like, why are we dead last?
Now we're seeing illicit fentanyl as the #1 drug threat in our state, backed very closely with methamphetamine.
If you really want to focus on the kids, stop acting like you're going to use foster care to punish parents.
There is a different way to approach justice that has better return on investment.
Working with families on the prevention end is more cost effective than placing them in foster care.
That seems to strengthen both law enforcement and courts and tie that together with community resources.
Justice has to be served for civil society to exist, but the place of mercy falls in the hands of the people.
And then track the impact to communities and better outcomes. And we're calling this approach SmartJustice.
SmartJustice is a work of Restore Hope and partner organizations. Restore Hope is a software and services organization that helps communities achieve better outcomes for justice and child welfare efforts. SmartJustice is focused on optimizing the system by improving the relationships among its parts.
My name is Charles Newsome. There are beautiful people in my community, but it's been impacted by incarceration, foster care, and poverty, and drug use. So when I hear about those things, I don't think about statistics. I think about faces I know. I think about real families torn apart. So what does that have to do with a podcast called SmartJustice? And what is this podcast even about? Paul Chapman, Executive Director of Restore Hope Arkansas, spoke with the podcast producer, Ed Lowry.
Walk me through a little bit about why this podcast, why call it SmartJustice, what's it all about?
So this podcast emerged after about a year and a half, and a bunch of very smart people from across the state, from all different kind of sectors within child welfare or incarceration or law enforcement or nonprofit service, giving input to this.
And we're going to be hearing from a number of those, as you said, really smart people that are involved in all these things throughout this course of the podcast.
Right.
Kind of the central theme of the first season is family. A lot of folks might not equate justice with family, but so why is that kind of the bedrock issue that is going to launch this thing?
The wisdom of the group came out that the family is the first institution. And if the family is not strong, then all these other things, then the government has to step in, community-based organizations like churches have to step in, and it usually is not as good as had the family been intact.
So what is the state of family, would you say, as far as in Arkansas, but maybe even more broadly than that?
Yeah, I'd say in compared to other states, we're in the bottom 50 percentile, and out of wedlock birth rate, we have a pretty high percentage of, like other Delta states, we have a pretty high percentage of child poverty.
Dr. Andrew Baker, Harding University professor and chair of the Parent Council, which provides oversight of legal counsel for parents in family court.
Well, there's no doubt that families are what create communities, and communities are what create a state. And if I have an unhealthy family, then likely you're going to have unhealthy communities. And when you have unhealthy communities, you create unhealthy things about your state. And a number of years ago, we led the nation in all the wrong categories, especially when it came to child welfare and recidivism. Like, come on, what's the give here? Why are we dead last? I don't find it funny. I find it tragically unfortunate. And to know that in that, the people paying the biggest price are kids.
In 2016, the Annie E. Casey Foundation, who's very involved in child welfare issues across the nation, they ran a report that showed that 16% of Arkansas children had a incarcerated parent before they were 18. That was the highest percent in the entire nation. Now, the reason why that's important, I think, following the data, is there's a study called Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs. There are 10 questions on this ACE exam that you can take, and it's pretty simple. You can get this done in a couple of minutes. But according to your score out of 10, if you answered yes to 4 or more of those questions, then you now become more than 400% more likely to, these are predictive, right? They're not certain, but you're 400% more likely to have chronic bronchitis as an adult. You're 1,200% more likely to attempt suicide. You're going to have more broken bones, more failed relationships, all those predictive things that we're talking about. But one of the questions, the very last question is, before you were 18, did you ever have an incarcerated parent? And so that'll get you 1 on the test. If you have 6 or more on this test, which in some of our programs with folks who are incarcerated, 6 is about the average. 6 or more on that test, you mark 20 years off life expectancy.
Pulaski County 10th Division Juvenile Judge Shanice Johnson shared practical perspective on adverse experiences.
So the types of cases that I see are dependency neglect cases, which are cases that involve foster care system, Department of Human Services. I also handle delinquency cases, in which those are cases in which kids that are accused of crimes are brought before the court. And then we also handle family needs and services cases, so which are cases in which any person over the age of 10, a child could petition, a parent, school, anyone with connection to the family could petition the court to request services. All the families that I see before me have at some point in their life, either the parents or the children that are impacted experience ACEs, which are adverse childhood experiences. And the significance of ACEs is that individuals who experience ACEs have a lower life expectancy, engage in more risky behavior, and it significantly impacts their decision making and the outcomes that they receive and experience in life.
Rich Huddlestone, Executive Director of Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, told us more about where Arkansas stands and the obstacles families in crisis face.
The research is pretty clear that if you had to pick one statistical indicator that really best predicts the well-being of kids in your state and also their future ability to succeed, it's the child poverty rate. Because the younger that you are when you live in poverty, and the longer of your life that you spend in poverty, really does have a profound impact on your ability to succeed later in life. Now, that doesn't mean that if you grow up in poverty that you can't succeed. Many people do grow up in poverty and end up succeeding. But what it does mean is that you face a lot more challenges, and the likelihood of you succeeding and getting out of poverty is lower if you live in child poverty. And over the past decade, while we've seen some fluctuations from year to year in the child poverty number, it always seems to be in the 20% to 25% of Arkansas kids living in poverty, and that tends to be one of the higher child poverty rates in the country. And we can't seem to break out of that between having 1/4 to 1/5 of our kids living in poverty. Those numbers I just gave you were for all kids under 18. But if you look at the child poverty rate for kids under 5, it always tends to be another 5 to 7 points higher than the overall child poverty rate. And so basically you have more kids who are living in poverty, kind of the youngest point in their lives, when that's the point when they really need those resources to thrive and succeed. And the other thing I would mention is that there are major racial and ethnic disparities in child poverty. Child poverty rates are often significantly higher for children of color. And last year, for example, the child poverty rate for white kids was about 16%, but if you look at the child poverty rates for children of color, it was 27% for Hispanic kids and about 39% for black kids. And so until we take steps as a state to intentionally address these gaps or these disparities in child poverty, we're always going to lag behind as a state, because we're going to have large groups of our kids who grow up into adults that are going to be behind both in their ability to succeed in the workforce, but also in the state's ability to succeed economically. And so we really think the child poverty rate is key, so we do a lot of talking about that.
We make it a full-time job to be poor. Just listen to anyone living in poverty and what they have to do to survive. It's a full-time job to survive. Okay, so what does it mean to be faithfully present into that? We want to fix. Our mentality is fix, fix, fix. Sometimes the system allows that to happen. My experience has been more times than not it doesn't. It just makes greater obstacles.
Issues such as poverty, community connections, and family status play into what is called social determinants of health.
The largest percentage of my physical health has to do with what we consider social determinants of health. How are my relationships with my family? Do I have friends? You know, how are my friends? What are they up to? How's work? You know, am I making enough money, or am I always stressed out and this toxic stress of worrying about, you know, how I'm going to pay the rent or keep the lights on?
Family and relational connections regarding the social determinants of health impact even people navigating incarceration.
I'm Scott McLean, founder, executive director of Pathway to Freedom, which is a Christ-centered holistic service program that provides educational, values-based pre-release and post-release services to prisoners and formerly incarcerated individuals in the criminal justice system. And when I look at the prison system and trying to develop these men and trying to break down that mindset and the criminal addictive thinking that they go through, it has to be broken down. When I think about family even further and what are the positives of being with a family, there's a lot of positive. When you talk about a sense of belonging, you talk about the impact that's been made, particularly for those in prison. When the research states, when there's a strong ties to a family, the impact to those in prison or formerly incarcerated individuals, the results of that will deter those statistics of returning back to prison quite often. So if we can continue to look at that and realize that that family connection really breaks the mold of a lot of things, it gives strength, it gives support, it helps them stay resilient even in the midst of them being in prison. That's why that support. We get a lot of guys that go through the system. I can remember several guys going through, a lot of guys, tons of them. And some of the comments when they first land, I haven't heard from my family. Very emotional. But when they have that support, a lot of these men in prison and females in prison can thrive and be productive even in the midst of going through prison, and resilient when things come against them, they can stand. They're not going through prison alone, But when they go through prison, they're going through it with their family, because the family suffers as a result of the isolation and the separation from them not being there. The other thing is the financial burden that they have to carry because a loved one's in prison that was supposed to be the one supporting them financially, the emotional support that's given. But the thing about it, when they're in prison, they realize, and they will say this, I'm not doing this alone. My family's with me. And it's hard to see the brokenness that's there because they realize the pressure that they themselves have put on their family because the absence. But it's great when you see a family connected to that because it causes them to be resilient. It causes them to be productive. It causes them to want to get involved in programs like Pathway to Freedom.
For the sake of this conversation, how do you define family? How are we defining family in this case?
You know, I think we could go with a traditional definition of having mom and dad and children. And there seems to be a good bit of data out that still shows that, children raised in a two-parent home have more advantages or have a better probable outcome in multiple areas, and health and achievement and income and relational connections. But I would say, in Arkansas, America broadly, Arkansas specifically, we have seen a real decline in the two-parent family. I think for our purposes, especially when we're talking about foster care and incarceration, we are trying to have a very broad definition of family as being those important people in which, especially during the formative years, that they have belonging and meaning and comfort and stability and deep relationships with. And that looks quite different now than it may have 50 years ago. And I would say that's how we're attempting to kind of address this, is meaningful relationships within a family structure, especially for children, is important for their long-term mental health, their physical health, their economic outlooks, their ability to take risks, their ability to have and maintain the types of relationships that we were talking about that lead to happiness and satisfaction and meaningfulness. And so we should always look in our policies and our actions, we should always look to try to preserve what that means for family. And so, for instance, when Department of Children and Family Services are required to remove a child from a situation, they immediately start looking for kin, so other extended family that the child may go to, and if they can't find anyone or can't place in that home, they start looking for what they call fictive kin. This would be someone who would be very important to the child. It could be a coach or a teacher or a neighbor who's been watching the child and already has relationships. So again, going with relationship.
Paul spoke with Mischa Martin, director of the Arkansas Department of Children and Family Services, to discuss the value the department places on family connection.
Yeah, so many people in our community, are all about saving the kids. We got to save the kids. But they forget that if you really want to save the kids, you got to save the family. Because kids belong with their families when it's safe and appropriate. And so when we really started looking, the administration at the transformation work that needed to happen in child welfare and started having conversations with people in the community, with our partners, it was very much like, guys, if we want to do what's right for these kids, we've got to figure out how to keep them safely with their families. And so we had started that work. And then all of a sudden comes along, so that was like 2015, 2016, of how do we build a child welfare system that just doesn't focus on foster care, but focuses on getting upstream and working with families to keep kids safely with their families. And when I say families, I don't just mean biological parents. Can they go with grandma? Can they stay with aunt, uncles? And now it's kind of shocking that when I talk about that to people, because they're like, well, obviously you were doing that, but we weren't in pre-2015, 2016. not only were we not placing kids with relatives as a first placement, we weren't placing kids with relatives once they were actually in foster care. In fact, only like 17% of kids in foster care were placed with relatives. So we had a lot of work to do then. So we start that work around how do we redesign our programs? How do we look at our funding streams to figure out how we shift some funding upstream? 2017 comes along, we're doing the work, and all of a sudden the Congress passes Family First, which was the federal legislation as to how child welfare is funded from the feds. And the basis of Family First is that you could actually start pulling down some prevention dollars, some funds for prevention services. So the prevention dollars came, but what you had to do was you also had to ensure that you were focusing on your kids in foster care being with family. So the feds were no longer gonna fund basically group homes. You were either in a foster home or you were in some type of treatment setting. Well, we were already doing that work. We, at the agency, we had said our kids belong with family. So if they can't safely stay with their family, then we want them with family in foster care, whether that is their bio family, a foster family. And if they cannot maintain in a family setting, they should be getting some treatment.
As we consider why healthy families are important, I want to bring back the quote from Dr. Andrew Baker earlier in this episode.
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that families are what create communities, and communities are what create a state. And if I have an unhealthy family, then likely you're going to have unhealthy communities.
So can strengthening families really help a community in crisis? Paul shares some history from Restore Hope work in Fort Smith and Van Buren, Arkansas.
What we now know is true is what Martin Luther King said decades ago. And he said, whatever impacts you directly impacts all of us indirectly. When in Fort Smith, the Whirlpool plant closed down and all those jobs were lost, including all the vendors that were kind of dependent on it, and those people stopped spending money in their community, it impacted their community in really awful ways. Free reduced lunch at school went up. I suspect if you went and looked at kind of academic achievement, it plateaued or started to decline. As the family started to struggle and descend into crisis, not just because they had good paying jobs, but because you had a lot of people at the plant who had they had meaning in their work. They had spent a long time becoming master at their trade. They had ascended some kind of dominant hierarchy and found their place and acceptance there, and they lost all that. In 2017, Fort Smith, Sebastian County, had the highest percent of children in foster care anywhere in Arkansas by a wide margin. I would have put them at the time, I'd put them in the top 10 worst in the nation. 1 in 34 children in Sebastian County in 2017 were in foster care. That was 800 kids in a county that only has 130,000 people in it. For reference, Pulaski County, the largest county in Arkansas, has about 400,000 people in it. We only had 525 kids in care at the same time. And so an event like the plant moving out that so many people worked at, finding meaning and employment and all those social determinants, right, impacted so many different other aspects of the community, including incarceration. Incarceration went way up, felony counts went way up, so it impacted crime also as people descended into hopelessness. So coming back to the family is when families are strong, crime goes down, foster care, child welfare issues go down, issues in school go down, and it ends up being this protection, the first protection, especially for children. So that we get out of this cyclical rate of trauma that is leading to, early death, off the chart drug use now, impact to kids, impact to jails, impacts to prisons, impact to being able to win new companies coming to our communities. We're going way upstream here. right? If you're standing next to the river and you see a baby in the river, you jump in, you pull the baby out.
Right.
And then another baby comes down, eventually, you got to send somebody upstream to find out why the babies are falling in the river. This is it. We are at the family to prevent the babies from falling in the river. We're that far upstream. It impacts everything else. It impacts our schools. You know, if it's chaos at school and high conflict and just survival of kids at school, that's going to impact the staff that you're going to be able to bring on, right? And so it impacts the morale and your retention of employees. It impacts your future base of employment. All communities spend a boatload of money on these issues, and very few actually have population level change. Those that did it in the same way. There were 5 aspects to it. And so if you're wanting to have community level change, then you're going to have to get 5 things right. You can get 2, 3, and I'm not saying you can't help people. You can help some people, but if you're wanting to have population level change, like big 10x kind of impact, then you're going to have to get a coalition together. We call it an alliance together around a common vision. And ours is we're going to help 100 families at a time move from crisis to career. You're going to have to define shared measurements. How do you judge your success or failure collectively? And so we bake that into, it's really around the social determinants of health, but they're baked into the software system. There's some friends, they became friends in Northwest Arkansas, had similar idea, built a software platform. They gave us the code base, which we've developed very specifically. And that's how we started tracking the data, which takes care of shared measurements and constant communication. And so you've got a judge, and you've got attorney ad litem's, and you've got DCFS, and you've got the folks that provide the parenting class that's needed, and the folks that provide the employment that's needed, and the housing authority that has the vouchers that might be used to get someone back on their feet so that they can move into permanent housing. And how do you organize all that? The answer is, in most places, it's not organized. It's a chaotic mess. It'd be like attempting to build a house without the builder just by emailing your plans to a bunch of subcontractors that you picked. And so it's a jacked up mess, and usually the outcomes are not good because the individual who's descended into that level of crisis needs multiple areas. There's no one agency that can take care of their needs, so there has to be some coordination. You know, part of the 5 things that are needed, you've got to have a vision, shared measures. You're going to have constant communication amongst the alliance that has this shared vision. You've got to figure out how to partner together. So the alliance in a crisis to career model, you have to have all the services that would actually allow someone to travel on the journey of crisis to career. So having the right folks involved. And then lastly is, and this is why most community collaboratives don't work, is everyone has a full-time job. You have to have a backbone organization, and that's the role that we play. And it took us many years. We did reentry work with then director of ACC, Kevin Murphy, who's a good friend and a wonderful partner. Then we got involved, Dr. Debbie Falbus over in Crawford County in Van Buren. She and Judge Baker, district court judge over there, were doing some neat things, and they called us over and brought us into a partnership for alternative sentencing. And all those things were good, but it was really in the child welfare area that we were getting our teeth kicked in over there. Like I said, 1 in 34 kids were in foster care in 2017 there. And so we had this group of DCFS workers and nonprofits. The call was there, and I remember Mayor McGill was there. He was a rep at the time and was about to run for mayor. And we were at the University of Arkansas at Fort Smith, who from the get-go was a wonderful partner. And everybody's frustrated and tired and demoralized. And we just said, you know, could we just try to help 100 families move from crisis to career? Could we do that? We're not going to get married, and it's not a Restore Hope program. It needs to have a name. Restore Hope is a contributor. We'll play our role. You play your role, and you play your role. But it's an initiative that the community owns, and that's when 100 Families was born. We're just, y'all are all frustrated. You're all frustrated with each other. You're all talking about each other. I know, because you've told me about him and her. And you probably are talking to them about me, right? It's just a high conflict, demoralizing situation. And everyone came together and agreed that it was worth putting up with each other to try to help 100 families.
Yeah, we really saw that change in collaboration in Fort Smith, not only at the local DCFS office, but really the whole community. You know, I was with you when Restore Hope first started the work there, and you would go to the meetings. Well, first I would start at the DCFS office, where I joke with them that I felt like there was a dark cloud over it, because you would just go in the DCFS office and you would feel the tension and the despair and the frustration and the anger, and it was really just frustration with the work that they were doing. They felt very attacked by the community. They felt overwhelmed by the work that they had to do with children and families. And I would leave there and we would go to whatever community meeting we were doing that day. And then you felt that same tension in the community. And everybody had big hearts and wanted what was best, but they were all frustrated about what was happening in that community. But really started with Restore Hope's leadership, having open conversations, giving them some tools. And pretty quickly, like, you could just feel a difference. Like, I love going to Fort Smith now. It's one of I enjoy going there. I have a great team there. The sun shines bright and they're excited about the work. The community is excited, but they all had to come together and create a shared vision and a shared value. Everybody couldn't stay in their corner and just fight about, you're not doing this, you're not doing that, or be in their corner and be like, I'm the one over here trying to do X, but you're not doing Y. And they had to stop the fighting with each other and create a shared vision and value about what they wanted for their community. And they did that work.
By the time we officially launched, there were 60 clients in this collaborative unit, this group. I can remember the first time we pulled up aggregate data in Fort Smith. I was sitting next to Chief Baker, and we said, here was the situation in housing and employment, and in child care and recovery. Here's where the clients were when we met them at intake. And here's where they were a snapshot of just last month. And he went, it's working. You could see the impact to housing and food and then employment as you're properly sequencing the help that already exists in a community. Instead of focusing kind of on inputs, now we're measuring outcomes. And it's a very different way of doing things. And I got to tell you that community is so tight, and they are continuing to innovate for the good of their community. The way that the community deals with those issues is so different. You can go ask any of the folks in authority. And that's the win, because they do that for 10, 15 years. Now you're into a full generation.
Yeah, and I think where Fort Smith even is different than sometimes we see in other places where community is coming together. Sometimes when I see community coming together, it's all the government entities. It's DCFS, it's law enforcement, it's child support, it's, schools. It's all the different government entities that are coming together trying to make a difference. But Fort Smith was different in that you saw business leaders, you saw churches, you saw nonprofits. Like, it was truly the community, not just the different government entities coming together. And don't get me wrong, I think that there's a lot of people in government with some big hearts that want to make a difference. But to make a community difference, like, the community has to come together.
So then we launched in Crawford, White, and Pulaski, and they all are producing similar outcomes, especially as it relates to like reunification rates, which are almost double. And so checkmark, it's scalable. Now we're trying to figure out, how do you actually get to the 25 most populated counties in Arkansas that cover 75% of all Arkansans? How do we get there? And the answer is not that we keep adding staff to Restore Hope. About a year ago, we had two groups, one in Texarkana and one in Russellville, saying, we are following what you're doing, it's absolutely needed here, and our community's right for this kind of collaboration. When are you going to come here? We said, you're on the list, but not soon. And then both of them came back about the same time, and they said, that's an unacceptable answer. So how about you just teach us how to do this? And so we developed an affiliate program in partnership with the Journey Church in Russellville and the Literacy Council of Miller and Bowie County. And they've got wonderful leaders deeply tied to the community, and we developed an affiliate program where they run 100 families, we'll support them in training their community members, and they're going. And so that's the way to kind of go forward now.
You started with the goal of 100 families, but where did it go?
You know, in Fort Smith, last report I looked at last month showed that the Alliance in Fort Smith had over 220 families actively in care at this moment. A family on average will stay in this collaborative care or in the 100 families program for about 8 months. You know, 350 families is the current capacity of Fort Smith to be able to serve in a collaborative way. Now, in partnership with DHS, we were just able to bring some additional resource to that community. So we may hit in the next 12 months, we may be over maybe even reaching to 500 families being able to be served in that community in a given year. And so some of the outcomes are that in Arkansas, if we take a child into foster care, only 43% of the time does that child go back home. We call it reunification. But for the families that opt into working with the 100 Families Alliance members, at the end of March of 2022, the current reunification rate was 84%, and it was 89% if you also included like kin, blood kin. And so it's wildly good. And I want to emphasize that this is not a program run by Restore Hope. Restore Hope is one actor in a coalition, or we call it an alliance, that includes DCFS, judges, attorney ad litems, the housing authority, licensed counselors, food pantries, SNAP benefits, adult ed. You know, it's being able to have all of those folks come and work much more efficiently together. And so not only are they more efficient in that I don't have to worry about, if I have an educational program, I don't have to worry about trying to help you find a house. I have partners in the alliance that specialize in that. Right. And so I just need to talk with them, and most of that's done through the software. Dana Baker over in Searcy, she's a coordinator for White County, and she put together her first annual kind of celebration in which Alliance members came, judges and DCFS staff, and she had 3 clients who came and shared part of their journey. Each time they mentioned being helped by someone, that group stood. And 3 clients told their stories. There were 8 to 12 organizations that were standing at the end of each of those stories. Wow. If you want to look at a picture of success, that's it. All the help exists in communities of any size. It's how is it that we help those organizations work together for the benefit of the client and for the effectiveness of our own program.
But it's a long, hard road from initial contact with a client to a success story. And that's what we're hoping to cover a little bit in the context of the podcast. So our next episode, we're going to be talking about addiction.
We've seen opioid use go off the charts and the deaths from it.
Right.
And so we need to address substance abuse and addiction. And is there any hope, especially given the potency of the new cocktails that are out there now?
After that, rolling into the topic of, in the next episode, the topic of incarceration.
I think we have a base core belief that incarceration has a direct impact. So the more we incarcerate, the lower the crime rate drops. And I would say that that's not necessarily so. And then the recidivism rate's at about 50%. So we need to understand that incarceration is an intervention. It is very expensive, and it works about half the time as far as preventing future crime.
Next episode, what about the kids? What's happening with the children in the context of that?
So let's just say there is mom and dad and Junior in the home, and dad's incarcerated. Now the pressure that puts on mom and the child, they're probably on government service like that. Right. Impacts also the ability of the child to succeed and thrive at school. So social determinants of health all go to negative. Right. So predictive outcomes in health and happiness and income all descend sharply. How do we minimize the impact? Otherwise, you're going to see that in 15 to 20 years. You're just gonna. Yeah. You're going to see it immediately in school. And so I would say, just as a detached financial investment in our communities, that's where we need to be truly focused.
That help that they could be provided probably gets into the question of the following episode, which is the role of trauma in all of this, in dissolving families, wrecking families.
Trauma is a way to get outside of your opinion and to actually look at predictive analytics of 10 events that may occur in a child's life and focus on minimizing those. I think the progression here is good, as we've talked about it, is substance abuse and addiction, incarceration, child welfare, the trauma it has, and then lastly, so what's the answer? How do the communities that are actually having real impact on doing things in this collaborative way, how are they doing it? Yeah. And what are the stories that they're telling? Right. And how does it look different to them? In summary, the goal for this series is for us to collectively recognize that the value of the family is preeminent in these areas, and not to try to engage in policy making and laws and actions that would somehow degrade the importance of the family. Harvard's done this longitudinal study. I believe it's the longest one ever run of this type, but it was on happiness. They started it in 1938 in the midst of the Depression. And they selected a number of children from kind of the privileged backgrounds and unprivileged backgrounds, and they followed now in multiple generations. They followed these children and their families and now grandkids. And their question is what really leads to fulfillment or meaning, or I'd say, we as Americans would say the pursuit of happiness. What impacts that? And they found that that happiness has to do with the deepness of relationships you have, and especially within your family. If you looked at one of these folks that they were studying at 50, and the biggest determination on how healthy they were going to be at 80 was the quality of their relationships at 50, which is just really surprising. I mean, you should exercise and you should do all those things, but the largest factor of my physical health is a set of circumstances that have to do with my relationships with work and my relationships with my family and my relationships with my friends. Thirdly, the research that's out there, and this is a recent book that Arthur Brooks, who's a professor at Harvard, in the business school, he teaches about happiness in Harvard Business. And he breaks down kind of the Harvard study into faith, and so some belief in something larger than you, family, for sure. Your joy and your pain, your deepest pain, can come from family. Your community, who you hanging out with, what's your community, what's the outlook in your community, and then lastly, some kind of meaningful work, something that you find purpose in, that you think that you're good at or contributing at a larger level. And so kind of wrapping all those different aspects up, we can't forget that the first institution is the family. And the stronger the family is, the less that these other incarceration and foster care, the less of that we'll have. And so how is it that we look at strengthening the family as being very, very important, and that we celebrate when that happens, given that we know that long-term happiness and long-term health all come from these deep, meaningful relationships, especially within family.
Thanks for joining us for Smart Justice. Come back next week for a conversation about the wide sweeping impact of addiction on justice and the family. Thanks again.
Smart Justice is a work of Restore Hope. Special thanks to this episode's guests, Andrew Baker, Rich Huddlestone, Scott McLean, and Mischa Martin. Thanks also to Churches for Life for sponsoring. Musical credits include H2O by Lee of the Stone, Through the Looking Glass by Moments, Late Rose by Cody Martin, Voyages by Belladrone, Silver Horizon by Ariel Red, and A Day Without Rain by Stephen Keach. All music is licensed through Soundstripe.com. Please consider helping us produce more work like this by becoming a donor at www.smartjustice.org. Thank you again.